Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. A lot of times, things in the Gita are pretty straightforwardly applicable in your daily life. For example, Krishna says, don't be attached to the results. Do your duty, whether it's pleasant or painful. These ideas you can go outside and practice them on your drive home. When someone cuts you off on the road. People suffer from road rage. I don't suffer from road rage. Maybe if I commuted like 2 or 3 hours a day, I might suffer from road rage, but for whatever reason, I don't get spun out in a car. It's a bad tendency. You're behind the wheel of a machine that can kill you or kill people around you, and so that's a bad idea to be uncool while you're driving a car. Yeah. But if you did suffer from road rage or just whatever, some of these lessons in the Gita, you could literally walk out the door, get in your car, drive home, and practice things multiple times throughout the day. Some stuff in the Gita is a little more abstract. The theological stuff about the nature of God, God's omnipotence or omnipresence or omnibenevolence or omniscience, that kind of stuff is more abstract. It's more abstract because we live in a largely atheistic world. We live in a world where God's not immediately visible to everybody as they go about their business on a Monday. You get confronted with the desirable and undesirable results of your actions on a daily basis. You get confronted with birth, death, old age, and disease on a daily basis. You get confronted with victory and defeat, heat and cold, pleasure and pain, happiness and distress, and everything in between on a daily basis. Therefore, messages, lessons which pertain to those items, they are extremely easy to apply in your life. It's just a hand in a glove. It's a ready fit. It's like if you cooked for a living and then people taught you stuff about cooking and you walked into work and techniques of how to cut vegetables or how to fry stuff or how to bake stuff or how to saute stuff. They were just immediately applicable in your life. I don't think the theological message of the Gita is any less practical or applicable or pragmatic. I don't think that stuff about God is less important or less practicable. It's just that most of us don't really think about God very much. The idea of God is a very abstract idea. We might look at logical arguments or aesthetic arguments for the existence of God. But we don't really live in a world where we feel like Jesus is our co-pilot, so to speak. Interestingly, serious spiritualists do live in a world where they think Jesus is their co-pilot. You can go to the heartland, also known as the flyover states, and you can meet people who think of the world that Jesus is with them at every moment, that Jesus is a co-pilot, where they're talking about Jesus all the time, where it's a very real, present thing in their life, as if they were talking about their brother or their father, whom they lived with. Huh? What'd you say? Whom they lived with. I gotta get a Chinese person where English is their second language to educate me on grammar. Yeah. So, it's not that it's impossible to live in a world where God is present with you, on your mind, a current affair. It's just that most of us don't. And so theologically heavy texts seem, for most people, to be abstract and more philosophical and less practical and immediate. For this reason, the most popular teachings of the Gita for the vast majority of people are going to be verses that have to deal with more or less an atheistic world. Maybe there's a law of karma and effect, Maybe there's a law of karma and effect. Something like that. Maybe people live in a world like that. There's a moral compass in effect. There's some kind of value system in effect. But most people don't live in a world where God is clear and present and immediate. There's a few reasons for this. One thing is that although the idea of theism is logical and has empirical evidence to support it, we don't live in a world where you walk out the door and God is having a conversation with you. The same way a traffic officer might. And so we live in a world where God is a concept. And although we might look at evidence for God, and that evidence may even segue into empirical evidence, it may be reasonable, there may be coherent theology, there may be logical theism, it's not the same as self-evident. The classic principles of foundationalism are things that have to be incorrigible, self-evident, and empirically observable. I think, therefore I am. That's a piece of wood. These are things which are immediately accessible to your senses. They're immediately empirically observable. They're self-evident, such as the statement, I think, therefore I am. They're incorrigible. They couldn't help but be true when you inspect them. Lots of the world is like this. It has the quality of being foundational. The notion of a God is not necessarily foundational. There is a school called Reformed Epistemology. Some really smart guys say, no, we should just assume God exists. And they have arguments for it, which I think are quite interesting. But nonetheless, I don't walk out of the temple room and see God the same way I see a car. I do think I experience that I'm not the body. That consciousness is different than matter. I do think that should be your default position. Somebody wants to say consciousness is material. I think they have the burden of evidence on them, because the self-evident experience is that consciousness is in fact different than matter. But although I believe in God and I believe in the soul, I feel really confident saying to somebody, you want to prove to me that the soul is not distinct from the body, that consciousness is not distinct from the body, the burden of evidence is on you, because it seems quite self-evident to me that there's a difference between a person and a chair. If you want to say they're ultimately one and the same, then the burden of evidence is on you. I nonetheless feel the burden of evidence is on us for proving that God exists. For the reasons I just mentioned. I think this is one reason why God is not as concrete of a concept for most people compared to chairs and cars and oxygen and temperature and numbers. The excessive note-taking is starting to get to me. If you're part of a live studio audience for a reason, if you're in the front row and you're just taking notes, it discourages me. I get some kind of energy from looking at people and talking to them. So I think that's one reason that God is not as immediately accessible to our senses. But you find a bunch of Christians in like Indiana, and they're talking about Jesus like he's their cousin or something like that. And like they're really cool cousin. Like they're just talking about all the time. So how do they bump that hump? How do they make that transition? On one hand, you could be that you're trained to just sort of blindly follow that plausibility structure, that you're just told this is what it is, and you don't question it. That's why sometimes you see the most zealous religious people also seem to be the most ignorant people. Kind of gives a bad rap to spiritualists around the world, because the really fervent people who are really committed, they tend to oftentimes be quite ignorant. And their faith appears to be quite blind and poorly construed. So although they might be part of the Jesus is my co-pilot tribe, upon inspection, they seem to be similar to many conspiracy theorists and quackpots, huh? Crackpot and quack what? Quack theory. Quagmire is different. Crackpots and quacks, which somehow I turned into, because a quack, that's a thing. You're a quack, or you're a crackpot. Somehow I made it into a quackpot. I'm a quackpot. These people appear to be quacks, and so somehow I don't want to follow in their footsteps. But then my gurus also seem to walk with Krishna at all times. as a monk, I slept at the foot of my guru's bed when we traveled, and I was a personal servant, as well as a protection detail, as well as a Johnny on the spot figure, and a errand boy, and a masseur, and a cook, and a cleaner, a travel agent, baggage handler, laundry service, and everything in between. I've slept at the feet of my guru's bed and heard him chanting all night long while he slept. There's been several devotees I've served that I've witnessed this with. I've spent days and weeks with my elders where they never broke form for even a minute. From the moment they woke up till the moment they went to sleep at night, they were talking about and thinking about Krishna without exception, without a break, without a take five. And in fact, their take five was to hear some kirtan or hear some scripture or honor prasadam or do some pranayam. That was their take five. They seem very clearly to me to be walking with Krishna through life. But not in a blind way, not in a crackpot way. But in a really deep and profound and amazing and magical and mystical and beautiful and attractive way. So much so that my life's work is to follow in their footsteps. How did they get there? On one hand, at first glance, the concept of God is abstract. More so than the concept of soul, which you can immediately experience as yourself. But we do find communities of people in the world that have a very vital experience of God, but the vast majority of them are foolish. But then there's this small cadre of individuals, and I'm assuming there are people in other traditions and other religions that are also on a high level. I just am familiar with the people from my own. How did they get there? How did they walk with God at every moment? Do you understand the question? Normally at this point I would ask for some answers, but the medium that we're communicating through doesn't lend itself to really rich dialogue, especially not back and forth, moment to moment. Zoom is something. It gives me something. I get to see some of you, but it doesn't lend itself well to just a back and forth like we would normally have in a robust discussion in a class. I think it starts with good theology, good strong arguments for the existence of God. which whittle their way into your consciousness. You know what whittling is? Whittling is when you take a piece of wood and a small knife and you carve something by cutting little tiny pieces off of it. You whittle something. You kind of carve it down. So it whittles its way into your consciousness, meaning that it burrows its way, digs its way, chips away at, insinuates itself into your consciousness. It might not even be the most appropriate usage of the term whittle, but generally if you whittle something down, you're breaking it down and cutting away at it gradually until there's nothing left. I don't mean in that way. I mean it insinuates its way in. It gets into you. You hear good, strong theology. You meet powerful spiritual people. Their presence inspires you and challenges the status quo. And then if they've got a good theology to back them up, those arguments and that vision affects you and disturbs your atheistic equilibrium. Enough that you begin to practice spirituality. Enough that you have some divine revelatory experiences. Enough that you stop doubting God's existence. Enough that you start to walk with Krishna through your life. Enough that on the surface you sound like the crackpots. But when people dig in, they find a heart of gold. They find a deep, rich, powerful, consistent, coherent vision that then starts them on their journey. How do you move from A to B, from theory to practice, from an idea to a mastery of the subject, from your first baby steps? It's the same as if you want to do anything in life. You meet devotees, they have a powerful theology, it makes sense, they've answered all of life's questions and all of yours, and then some. You get enthused, you practice enough that you have some realizations, enough that you stop doubting, enough that you start experiencing, enough that it becomes part of your reality. And then you become a touchstone for the next generation. So, we dealt with this idea that Krishna sounds like a crackpot in the chapter when he says he's super old. And Arjuna asks him, what's the deal? And he says in text 5, many, many births, both you and I have passed. I can remember all of them, but you cannot. It's page 186 in my book. What does Krishna establish here? What's just been communicated by Krishna to Arjuna? Yeah.
There's a distinct difference between him and Arjuna.
And what is it?
He's omnipotent.
He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. I don't see any omniscience here. What Krishna explains here is that he remembers his past lives. Is that omniscient? No. Many, many births have both you and I passed. I can remember all of them, but you cannot. You find people, like you find palm readers in little shops all over America that make the same claim. You'll see a bunch of people tell you they can remember their past lives, right? Maybe, I mean, certainly he knows more. Maybe you could say he's super intelligent, but I think it's a far cry for omniscience, don't you? Next verse. Although I'm unborn, and although my transcendental body never deteriorates, and although I'm the Lord of all living entities, I still appear in every millennium in my transcendental form. What's that indicate?
It is God.
Yeah, we're starting to get like maybe you could get squeeze a little omniscience out of that last one if you interpret it. This one's starting to sound real godlike, right? I'm unborn. Are you unborn? Yes. Although my transcendental body never deteriorates. No, now you're starting to get an omnipotence. But, theoretically, an angel could live in a form that never deteriorates. So it's not, in this world, you're starting to get an omnipotence. But, theoretically, maybe an angel appears in this world in a spiritual form. All right, so we're not quite there yet. And although I'm the Lord of all living entities, that's a dead giveaway. Like, I'm eternal, you're eternal. Okay, but you're from heaven and I'm not, so you have a spiritual body that never deteriorates, but I have a body that deteriorates. Okay. Oh, you're the Lord of all living entities? Okay, you're God. Like, each claim is a little more fantastical than the last. And now you've got a straight claim to divinity. But it's not that every single point was a straight claim to divinity. Does that make sense? I still appear in every millennium in my original transcendental form, and now because he's the Lord of all living entities, and he appears over and over again in this world, now Krishna is the avatar. Ava means down, and tar means to cross. So he crosses down. Avatar is someone who crosses down from above. Doesn't necessarily mean God. But if you're the Lord of all living entities, and you come into this world, then you're both God as well as the avatar. Do you follow this? And this isn't like an avatar, like, oh, who's your guru? Oh, he's an avatar. Ooh. Like, this isn't an avatar like that. The word avatar is used really cheaply these days in neo-Hindu circles. This is an avatar with a capital A. It's God appearing in this world. Now, how can God appear in this world? This world's made out of matter, God's spiritual. Well, an omnipotent spiritual being could appear in this world because that's what omnipotence means. So we certainly can't rule out the possibility. These are theological ideas. They're ideas about the nature of God, and they're ideas about the nature of Krishna. This is the first time these ideas are introduced in the Gita. Now we're getting into some theology. Everything prior to this is really pre-theistic, and it's spiritual, but it's pre-theistic. You're not forced to confront the idea of an omnipresent, omnipotent deity. But it's changing now. And Krishna's explaining that he's God. Every spiritual text will have a place where the authenticity of the text is outlined, or the nature of the deity that's talked about in the text is outlined. We're finding the beginning of that here in the Gita. You follow? It would be quite natural to ask at this point. So it's like, well, you know more than me. Okay, you know your past life. Like, what does that mean? Are you some kind of angel? No, actually, I'm God. And I appear in this world. Well, why do you appear in this world? Well, he said previously that he appeared He's appearing to re-instruct the science. Is that it? Or is there some... So you could extrapolate from what was said previously. You could sort of try to figure it out, but it'd be a natural question to ask. So you can look at the progression. Krishna says to Arjuna, hey, I taught this science a long time ago at the dawn of creation. Come on, what do you mean? Yeah, I come here in every millennia in a spiritual form and teach this message. I was just on the phone with Leela the other day. We were doing something. I don't remember what we were doing, but it was something. We were figuring something out, plotting to take over the world. Probably checking the prices on produce or something like really vital like that. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, we were working. And some guy called up. So I took the call and then merged the call back. And so it was Leela and myself and this person who called in. I said, you're on the phone with myself and this other person. So is this the Hare Krishna temple? I said, yes, Hare Krishna. He goes, I want to come and see you. I go, okay, well, the temple's closed down for coronavirus, but certainly when we open back up again, you're more than welcome to come down. And he said, great, I'm really into bhakti. And I was like, okay, well, what do you mean by bhakti? Well, I mean, I meditate. I'm like, oh, what do you meditate on? He's like, well, all meditation is the same. I'm like, oh, okay, what is all that? What's all meditation about then? It was about becoming God. I'm like, oh, okay, sure. And I'm like, well, we're into bhakti too. Bhakti is based on the idea that there's an all-good and all-powerful deity that's the source of everything. And so, the only thing you need to do to connect with that deity is cry out and open your heart up, and that liberation becomes a gift, a gracious gift from an all-good and all-powerful God that loves you. And for a bhakta, the idea of becoming God is abhorrent. Same way a mother doesn't want to become one with her child. And although we may be similar to God, we may be spiritual and eternal, and we may be able to exist in perpetuity, and we may even to some extent be filled with knowledge and bliss, as sparks of divine splendor, we never become God per se. There's always a distinction made, and that distinction between the soul and God allows for love to unite them together forever. But as soon as you get rid of that distinction, the idea of love, which is a unifier between a lover and a beloved, as soon as you get rid of that distinction, that love evaporates. Just like if there's no child, there's no love between a mother and a child. So I just, rattled off a little ABCs of our theology to educate this person that, about bhakti. He was like, wow, I really want to learn from you. And I said, great. When we open back up again, you can come down. He goes, yeah, on June 28th of next year, I'm going to reveal myself to be God incarnate. And so I want to prepare for that event. And I was like, that's fantastic. Let's talk soon. I got to go. Adios. Thank you so much for calling. This happened 2 days ago. It's pretty normal for me. I meet Jesus at least once a month. See, some guy comes to the temple and tells me he's Jesus at least once a month. But sometimes he calls too. So this guy called. So Krishna starts out and he says, hey, I instructed this a long time ago. And Arjuna says, what do you mean? He goes, we've been around for many lifetimes. We're eternal souls, but I remember everything. What are you, like an angel or something? No, actually I'm the Lord of all creatures. I come into this world. Well, why do you come into this world? Is it just to educate me, or is there some other greater purpose? Whenever and wherever there is a decline in religious practice and a predominant rise of irreligion, adharma, the opposite dharma. Dharma, when there's decline, dharmasya glani, there's the decline of dharma. And then it's and there's adharmasya abhyutanam. There's a rise of adharma. Then at that time, tadatmanam shajamyam. At that time, I manifest myself. So it's not just to instruct Arjuna, but it's rather to set things straight and reestablish Dharma. And then that next verse makes that even clearer. To deliver the pious and annihilate the miscreants, as well as to reestablish the principles of religion, the principles of Dharma. Dharma samstapana. Establishing Dharma. Samstapanartaya, for the purpose of establishing Dharma. Sambhavami yuge yuge. I appear millennium after millennium. So what we get is we get to the idea that God is very knowledgeable. We also get the idea that it's the Lord of all beings, really God's omnipotent. And now we get this idea that God's concerned about the world. There's some benevolence. An all-powerful God could help the world, and all good God would want to. And so you're starting to get the makings of a theology here. There's sentience, and almost you're getting like a very knowledgeable, maybe even omniscient being. Can't quite go that far, but we're headed in that direction. Now we've got this omnipotence in the sense of being the Lord of all creatures. And now we've got this omnibenevolence in the sense of wanting to come down and help out. It might not be a lock that we have the triple O God, but we're headed in that direction. We know the who and the why and the when and the how. Who is it? It's Krishna, it's God, right? Who and what are the same thing? It's God, it's Krishna. How? Because he's omnipotent. Why? Because he's omnibenevolent. What? He's descending into the world. When? Every millennia. Where? Right here. You're getting some of these questions answered. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Some of these basic ideas of a theology are being articulated for the first time in the Gita. And this stuff's going to come up again and again, but as we're talking about moseying through how to be a little more detached, how to be a bit more Zen, you also get some theological training. You also start to be introduced to the idea of God. Well, how is this relevant to us? One who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving this body, take birth again in this material world, but that person attains my eternal abode. So the result of understanding this is that you become liberated. If you understand the avatar, if you go with the flow, if you put yourself in that divine current, if you follow the program, if you learn about Krishna, then that learning about Krishna, it transforms you. It's cathartic. The act of learning about God creates catharsis. For instance, if you study the history of slavery, if you study the legacy of slavery and the suffering and the pain it's caused, then automatically you become anti-slavery and anti-racist. You follow? To know him is to love him. It's a famous biblical statement. To know him is to love him. If you learn, think about you fall in love with people, There's a song by The Doors, Hello, I Love You, Won't You Tell Me Your Name? You guys know the song? It's an interesting idea. Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Right? It indicates that you don't know the person. You just saw them and you find them attractive, so it's like that's enough. You're super shallow. Like the most shallow dude on the street. It's obviously a guy talking to a woman because that's the only person who falls in love at first sight. Some super shallow, materialistic person, right? She holds her hips so high like a statue in the sky. Her arms are wicked and her legs are long. When she moves, my brain screams out this song. So it's like, it's clear. It's like, hello, I lust you is really what he's saying. But when you see somebody, you actually process information about them. You get a sense of who they are. What part of the world they're from, what their parents look like, how old they are. And when you look at somebody's countenance, you look at their visage, you look at their face, you get a sense of who they are. You look in their eyes, you get a sense of who they are. You're gaining knowledge about the person when you see them. You talk to them, you gain more knowledge about them. And really, falling in love with somebody is getting to know somebody. You understand? This idea that knowledge creates a relationship, creates a feeling, this isn't very abstract. You get to know somebody and you learn about them. You develop a feeling for them. You do that with Krishna and the same thing happens. It's like a miracle. Because Krishna is omnipotent, that knowledge of Krishna creates a relationship and it attracts Krishna. And Krishna becomes present in your life divinely. Supersedes all your other relationships and becomes the most important person in your life. One of our teachers 3 centuries ago commented that when you meditate on Krishna, you think you're meditating on Krishna, but it's really just an idol because it's your mind, it's your thoughts of your mind. How is that like any less of an idol than if you built an idol out of bricks and stone? It's your mental images. They're not spiritual. But when Krishna sees someone meditating in earnest on him, he laughs, seeing how they're trying to think with their thoughts and build a stairway to heaven. And so he takes away, step by step, the material vision they have of Krishna, and he replaces it with who he actually is without you really knowing. And what started off as building a stairway to heaven eventually becomes a divine revelation. And then the devotee begins to meditate on Krishna, and Krishna really appears to them. This is the beginning of that. You get introduced to a dangerous idea, a dangerous concept, the idea of God. Not incoherent and babbling, like some pious but wacky evangelist, but to some kind of substantive, serious tradition. And that idea rattles around in your brain, takes root. Practice Krishna consciousness. You start to learn about Krishna. And as you do, you fall in love with Krishna. And as you fall in love with Krishna, you fall out of love with the material world. So much that you do anything for Krishna. You know, I was writing a little love letter to my wife on, I don't remember why I did it. It was Mother's Day, maybe? Oh, it was my anniversary, thank you. I was thinking it'd be weird to write on Mother's Day, and I was like, if I couldn't think of anything else, I was like, anyways, a little jumbled up. I was writing like a public love letter for my wife. We're not super PDA, but sometimes I go to India, I'll like hold her hand and get all PDA just to be subversive, because India is a super conservative culture. But I've been around long enough, and I've been married long enough. I'm not like a newbie. So sometimes I'll hold my wife's hand in public in India, but generally we're not like crazy PDA. Of course, generally I don't go out. I don't get out that much anyway. But I'm just kind of like thinking it through as I'm talking. But so I wrote this, public protestation of love towards my wife of 22 years on our 22nd wedding anniversary. And I said, hey, lights! Okay, let's turn it back on. I said at some point something like, chivalrous, like kill or die for you 1,000 times over, something like that, without a moment's hesitation, something like that. And I mean that. But what did I do for Krishna? Like, we're not even in the ballpark. It's easy to die for people. Try living for somebody. That's the real miracle. But anyway, as much as I love my wife and as devoted as I am, it's not even a drop in the bucket of how much I love Krishna. Krishna becomes real for the devotee. Step by step. You learn about Krishna, you explore that, you experiment with it, you get results, you learn more, you go around and around, there's some upward mobility, you get closer, you fall in love with Krishna, you fall out of love with this material world, and at some point, you're all in. One devotee, Mukunda Datta, he came into a kirtan in heaven that he wasn't supposed to be in. And Krishna said, you have to leave. Chaitanya said, you have to leave. And he said, when will I see you again, my Lord? Hundreds of millions of lifetimes. And Mukunda was in ecstasy. He thought, like, great. Like, okay. Like, that's it? I could do that standing on my head. And the Lord was moved by his love, by his faithfulness. And he was welcomed back in. Love, devotion, bhakti, the big secret is, it attracts even Krishna. What do you get for the person who has everything? You give them your love. Because they don't have that. You can't buy somebody's love. It's a gift. Real love has to be given freely. And so what do you get for the person? What do you get for God? You give him your love. And then Krishna becomes attracted by that love. Love is Krishna Karshini. It attracts the all-attractive one. Krishna becomes intrigued by such love. That's our part in a synergistic relationship of grace. We start out and we learn something about Krishna, just like in the pages of this text. And then we work with that, we try it out, we explore it, we experiment with it. And results come back. And those results inspire us. And we go back in earnest and we deepen our practice. With our newfound realizations, we deepen our practice. And that allows us to dive even deeper into the ocean of devotion. And then more gems come out of that exploration. And we go back and forth like that, synergistically, receiving mercy from above and receiving an answer to our call. Till eventually Krishna is no longer a concept. He's a person that you know, a person you can count on, a person who's shown he's always there for you. And Jesus is your co-pilot, but you're not blind. You're not a foolish evangelical who's never questioned his faith. You're a spiritual journeyman who's put the time in and who's drawn down fruit from the eternal tree of knowledge that can't be taken away from you. And your devotion becomes like a line in a stone. It's etched in. It can't be moved. It's who you are. It's etched on your soul. It starts with this kind of stuff. Wrapping your head around the idea of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent deity. What that does to the world in which you live, if such a being existed, and how that becomes the primary purpose of your existence, and how that becomes the barometer, arbiter of all decisions you make. Does this bring me closer to Krishna? Does this take me away from Krishna? I spend my day doing all kinds of nonsense. But I avoid nonsense which categorically takes me away from Krishna. Therefore, I follow the four regular principles. Therefore, I chant japa. Therefore, I worship the deity. I fill my day with things that bring me close to Krishna, and I don't do things that take me too far away. I dabble, I play around, but not enough that I forget what I'm really here for. Okay. And if you know Krishna, you fall in love with Krishna, you fall out of love with the material world, and you become liberated. Also, if you understand Krishna, how Krishna, the Supreme Lord, is able to be in this world but not of it, then you also start to be in this world but not of it. Like Krishna, you begin to mirror Krishna's program, and you surgically exist in this world as a spiritual being without becoming overly enmeshed in it. So Krishna, knowledge of Krishna makes you fall in love with the concept of God, but there's also a very practical sense in which Krishna is able to exist in this world without becoming affected by it, and you can literally copy that. Just like you're eternal, Krishna's eternal. You have a lot of stuff in common with God. You exist forever, Krishna exists forever. You're conscious, Krishna's conscious. You can love, Krishna can also love. We have lots of stuff in common with God. Not everything. God's the source of everything. We're not the source of everything. God's the creator, we're the created. We have tons of stuff in common with Krishna. One thing we have in common with Krishna is we can be in this world but not of it. And as you start to study Krishna and understand a being existing in this world but not being of this world, you start to become a being that's in this world but not of this world. And so the theology doesn't, and here's the hat trick. Here it is. Amazingly, the theology doesn't take away from the practical theistic, pre-theistic life lessons that you can take home with you. It actually enhances them. And you get everything. You get great lessons on how to live in this world without being too attached, even deeper because you have somebody you can model, a perfect model. And at the same time, you get to fall in love with God. And those two things work together synergistically. And so it's not that there's two teachings, the ones you can practically apply and the ones which are more abstract. That's not actually true. When you get into theology, that is a practical lesson you can use in your life, and it gives you a relationship with God. And it's not merely pre-theistic anymore, but it's all that and more. And as we're ramping up in the Gita, and we're warming up, and we're catching up, and we're moving forward, we're now delving into actual theology. Which means you get everything that came in the first few chapters, and so much more. And you see evidence of this. Anyway, we'll read a couple more verses. Being freed from attachment, fear, and anger, being fully absorbed in me and taking refuge in me, many, many persons in the past became purified by knowledge of me. And thus they all attained transcendental love for me. You see this move from knowledge to love. You see that it's transformative. The knowledge transforms you. It's not that you know Krishna and that's it. You know him and you become free from attachment, fear, and anger. And you become purified. And you fall in love. And so this sojourn I described is perfectly articulated in these verses of the Gita. As all surrender unto me, I reward them accordingly. Everyone follows my path in all respects. That's a heavy statement. Wow. The Gita is filled with a lot of stuff. It's also filled with the transcendental person, Krishna. And if you're ready for that leap of faith, if you're ready for that leap of theism, then you can experience Krishna in the pages of the Gita. And not merely some valuable life lessons. I think we'll wrap it there. What are we down to? 2 minutes. All right. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, IGTV, for participating. You can stay on Zoom.